In October 1992, on the slope of Annapurna, one of the most dangerous mountains in the world, where every third climber dies, one of the most shocking dramas in the history of mountaineering will play out. Two Frenchmen will find themselves in a death trap at an altitude of 7,300 meters, where any mistake means instant death. When the hope of rescue is gone and the chances of survival are almost nil, one of them will do something so incredible that even after 30 years, climbers speak of it with a shudder in their voice. What will happen on this mountain will revolutionize all notions of human possibility. At over 8,000 meters above sea level stands one of the world's most dangerous 8,000-meter peaks, Annapurna Y. Its south face, which is almost sheer and about 2,500 meters long, is considered a real challenge even for the most experienced climbers. This mountain has earned a grim fame. Every third person who tries to conquer its summit dies. By October 1992, no one had managed to make a new route up the south face in an easy and fast style, without setting up intermediate camps and additional support. October in the Himalayas is a special time. The monsoon season, when heavy rains hit the region, is over, and the harsh winter storms have not yet begun. At this time of year, the weather is usually more stable, giving climbers a chance for a successful ascent. However, even during this period, the weather is unpredictable. Sudden snowfalls and squally winds can hit the slopes in a matter of hours. The south face is a complex terrain of steep ice, sheer cliffs, and overhanging cornices. During the day, the sun heats up the upper layers of snow and ice, causing rock falls and avalanches, while at night, the temperature drops to 30 degrees Celsius. There are two main approaches to climbing the world's highest mountains. The classic one, when climbers set up several camps at different heights, bring their oxygen tanks, food, and equipment, and help them in this local mountain guides, Sherpas. And more complicated and risky way is the Alpine style. Here, everything is based on speed and lightness. 2 or 3 climbers take a minimum of food and equipment with them and climb without additional support and oxygen. This is the cleanest, but also the most dangerous way of conquering the summit. Every extra gram of equipment can be decisive between life and death, and any mistake at such a height is fatal. Pierre Béguin did not look like the typical image of a fearless mountain conqueror. At 41, this calm, thoughtful mechanical engineer from Grenoble, France, was more like a university professor. With a doctorate and working as an avalanche expert, he brought a scientific approach to every climb. For him, the mountains were not just a sporting challenge, they became a philosophy of life. By 1992, Béguin had already climbed 5 mountains over 8,000 meters, including the legendary K2. There are only 14 such mountains in the world, and they are considered the highest goal in mountaineering. This list of achievements and unique experience made him one of France's strongest Himalayan climbers. He lived in a small village at the foot of the Alps with his wife Annie, fully dedicated to the mountains and to finding the most difficult routes. His partner, 27-year-old Jean-Christophe Lafay, represented a new generation of French mountaineering. Originally from Gap, a small town in the French Alps, he began climbing as a child and quickly achieved outstanding results. Lafay could climb the most difficult rock routes that only a few people in the world could do, but his main advantage was his incredible stamina. He could work for hours on sheer cliffs without losing concentration. Despite his experience in the Alps, where he worked as a mountain guide, Lafay had never been to the Himalayas before. For him, this expedition was to be his entrance ticket to high-altitude mountaineering. They met in early 1992 at a prestigious mountaineering award ceremony in Paris. Béguin, who was receiving the prize for Himalayan climbs, took notice of the young climber whose achievements in the Alps were impressive in their technicality. He saw in Lafay someone who could be the perfect partner for a difficult technical climb. They shared a common desire for pure mountaineering, without the use of supplemental oxygen and numerous supports. As Béguin himself said, in the mountains, it's not only strength that counts, but also the ability to think. And LaFay added a fresh perspective and incredible tenacity. No one could have predicted that this partnership, which seemed like the perfect blend of experience and youth, would end in one of the most dramatic stories in the history of mountaineering. Begin and LaFay spent 2 weeks at base camp at 4,200 meters to acclimatize, gradually accustoming their bodies to the altitude. Each day they climbed higher and higher and then descended back down for an overnight stay, a tactic that allows the body to adapt to the thin air. Here, at the foot of the mountain, they scrutinized the route through binoculars, noting every potentially dangerous section. The south face of Annapurna opened up before them in all its glory. Steep ice slopes below, steep ice-covered cliffs above, and overhanging snow cornices at the very top. Unlike conventional expeditions, where climbers use kilometers of ropes to organize insurance and the help of locals to carry their loads, Begin and LaFay decided to go light. All their gear fit into 2 backpacks weighing 15 kilograms each. Begin, as the more experienced, took the main part of the technical equipment: ropes, hooks, and tabs, special devices that are hammered into rocks or ice to organize insurance. LaFay carried a tent, a light tent weighing a little over 1 kilogram, some food, and some general equipment. They planned to climb in 4 or 5 days, find a new route where no one had gone before, and descend back before supplies ran out. The ascent started in the first days of October 1992. The first day went well. They climbed to the height of 5,500 meters, overcoming steep ice slopes. For the night, they cut out a small area for a tent in the ice. Such places are called bivouac by mountaineers. In the morning, we moved on. LaFay, despite his lack of altitude experience, held himself perfectly. His climbing skills proved invaluable on difficult rocky sections. Begin, on the other hand, confidently picked his way, finding the safest passages among the maze of crevasses and ice traps. Each day they gained altitude. On the 3rd day they reached 7,000 meters, a height where the air is so thin that every step requires enormous effort. Here many climbers begin to use oxygen tanks, but Begin and LaFay climbed without them. By the evening of the 4th day, they were at 7,300 meters. With less than 800 meters to the summit, success seemed close. But it was at this point that the weather, which had remained relatively stable all these days, began to change rapidly. The rising wind and the first snowflakes were only harbingers of an impending storm that would soon change the lives of both climbers forever. The first gusts of wind at 7,300 meters did not cause much concern, as they often do in the mountains. Begin and LaFay managed to set up their tiny tent on a narrow rock ledge, barely enough to lie down. But by nightfall, the wind had picked up to the point where the thin walls of the tent were buckling under its pressure, and the whistling and roaring of the storm drowned out the climbers' voices. By the next morning, the situation had only worsened. Visibility dropped to a few meters because of the snow veil. The temperature dropped to 30 degrees and the wind gusts reached 80 kilometers per hour. In such conditions, it would have been suicidal to continue the ascent. Begin and LaFay decided to wait out the weather, hoping for an improvement, a common practice for high-altitude climbs. The next 2 days became a real test of human endurance. A tent slightly larger than a sleeping bag became their only refuge from the killer cold. They took turns sleeping, huddled together in an attempt to retain precious warmth. Every time they had to go outside, even for simple human necessities, it became a dangerous adventure, as gusts of wind threatened to throw them off the narrow ledge. Food and water were distributed with extreme care. Each meal was a handful of freeze-dried food or a few pieces of chocolate, which had to be spread out over many hours. To get water, we had to melt the snow on a small gas burner, which took a long time at such an altitude. Because of the thin air, the boiling point was much lower than in normal conditions, but the flame from the burner was negligible, due to the lack of oxygen. Every drop of the precious liquid was carefully distributed among the climbers. The storm did not cease for a moment. The roar of the wind was so deafening that they had to shout to hear each other even in the tent. The walls of their flimsy shelter were constantly buckling under the pressure of the elements, threatening to burst at any moment. The thin tent was the only barrier between them and the 30-degree temperature. The nights were especially frightening. The darkness and the incessant rumble of the storm created a feeling of complete detachment from the world. The narrow rocky ledge that served as their bivouac site was gradually covered with snow. Every hour Began or LaFay had to climb out to clear away the accumulating snow, its weight threatening to collapse their fragile shelter. Any careless movement could trigger an avalanche. The freshly fallen snow clung to the steep slopes like gunpowder, ready to explode at the slightest jolt. Their situation was complicated by complete isolation. Unlike modern expeditions, they had no satellite phone or weather forecast. They could rely only on their experience and intuition. Began, who had spent a lot of time in the Himalayas, realized that if the storm dragged on, their chances of survival would begin to fade by the hour. On the third day of the storm, food supplies were running low. But worse, the freshly fallen snow had drastically changed the condition of the route. Every inch of it increased the risk of avalanches, and the icy rocks became even more treacherous. The temperature continued to drop, and the wind not only did not subside, but seemed to grow even stronger. At this point, Began, after scrutinizing the conditions, made a decision that would change the fates of both climbers forever. They must descend, immediately. The decision to descend was made on the morning of October 11th. After 2 days under siege from the elements, they realized further waiting was like death. Beguine, as the more experienced, went first. He had to hang ropes for insurance on particularly difficult parts of the descent. LaFay remained in position, ready to follow him. Visibility was so poor that they could barely distinguish each other through the thick veil of snow. Every gust of wind threatened to knock them off their feet. Before starting the descent, Began spent a long time choosing a place for a belay point. Finally, he found a suitable crack in the rock and set up a friend, a special mechanical device with a spring mechanism that expands inside the crack, securely anchored in it. Under normal conditions, such devices can support the weight of several people, and Began, as an experienced climber, used them thousands of times. Having secured the main rope to the frente, Began began a careful descent. LaFay watched his every move carefully, holding the safety rope and ready at any moment to break his partner's possible fall. Despite the blizzard, he could make out Began's silhouette slowly descending the snow-covered wall. Everything happened in a matter of seconds. First came a frightening crack, the sound that every climber dreads to hear the most. It was neither the usual crunch of snow underfoot nor the sound of wind. LaFay knew at once something had happened to the binding. The next instant he saw Began's face. Their gazes met one last time, the realization of the inevitable frozen in his partner's eyes. Friend, unable to bear the load, was completely torn out of the icy crack along with chunks of rock. Began, a seasoned Himalayan climber, began a fall that nothing could stop. The rope connecting the climbers snaked downward, taking with it all the technical equipment attached to Began: the main ropes, hooks, carabiners, bookmarks. A second later, his figure vanished into the white gloom of the raging storm. LaFay's cry was drowned in the roar of the storm. He knew that a fall from such a height left no chance of survival. His partner had just plunged into a chasm more than 1,000 meters deep. For the first few minutes, LaFay remained motionless, unable to comprehend what had happened. But reality was merciless. He was left alone at 7,300 meters, with virtually no equipment, in truly inhospitable conditions. For the next hours after Began's fall, LaFay remained in the same spot, trying to comprehend what had happened and assess his situation. It was then that an accident occurred that in an instant drastically reduced his chances of survival. At high altitudes, when the sun heats up the upper layers of rock, rockfalls are common. Despite the blizzard, one of these rocks had come from somewhere above and hit his right arm. The impact was in his forearm, and LaFay immediately realized it was a fracture. The pain was so intense that he couldn't move his arm for several minutes. The injury was a serious complication. LaFay could only move his finger slightly. Hands are the most important tool of a mountaineer, especially on the descent, when it is necessary to work with ropes, to organize insurance, to cling to rocks. Now he had to do it all with one hand. After losing his partner and injuring his hand, Lefay found himself in a situation that for most climbers would mean certain death. He had minimal equipment at his disposal: a thin cord 20 meters long, which in normal conditions is used only as an auxiliary, one carabiner for insurance, and a pair of crampons for moving on the ice. Of the unusual equipment, aluminum tent poles, which were never intended for mountaineering purposes. Lefay spent the first 24 hours after the tragedy in complete immobility. The shock of what had happened and the pain in his arm confined him to his seat. But when he ran out of food, he realized he had to descend, or he would simply freeze to death in his tiny shelter at 7,300 meters. To descend, Lefay developed a risky technique. Using his only healthy arm and teeth, he hammered aluminum tent poles into the ice or cracks in the rocks. To these he would attach his thin cord and descend half its length. Then he would pull up the cord and repeat the process. It was a very unreliable system. The tent poles were not designed for such a load and could break out at any moment. But the real test was ahead of him. During one of the descents, one of the crampons, special devices with sharp teeth for walking on ice, slipped off his boot and flew down. That meant he now had only one crampon on his left foot. On the steep ice of the south face, such a loss is practically a judgment call. It's impossible to stay on a 70-degree slope with only one crampon. Lefay continued his descent using the only remaining crampon and his healthy hand, with his right hand only slightly holding onto the terrain. Every meter of descent could be his last. One wrong move, one slip, would be enough to repeat Bagan's fate. Gritting his teeth against the pain, he slowly made his way down, realizing he had no other options. By the end of the second day of the descent, what the climbers themselves would later call a miracle happened. Climbing along a narrow rock ledge, Lefay stopped to catch his breath. It was at that moment that his gaze fell on a small snowbank on a ledge just out of his path. There was something metallic sticking out of the white mass, gleaming even in the dim light of the overcast day. At first he couldn't believe his eyes. The chances that the lost cat had not flown into the abyss, but had ended up here, were slim to none. Cautiously approaching the find, Lefay did indeed discover his lost cat. It was stuck in the soft snow that had accumulated on the rock ledge. If the snow had been harder, she would have simply bounced off and flown down. If the ledge had been a little smaller or at a different angle, she wouldn't have stuck. If Lefay had taken a different route down, he would never have noticed her. All these coincidences added up, giving him a second chance. Now, with both crampons, he could move much more confidently on the steep ice, which greatly increased his chances of reaching the lower sections of the wall alive. But there were 3 more days of grueling descent ahead of him, where every meter could be his last. Lefay's descent down the south face of Annapurna lasted 5 days. After acquiring a second cat, his chances increased, but the dangers were literally breathing down his neck. He decided to travel mostly at night. There was less risk of rockfall in the dark because the frozen ice held the rocks more firmly in place. During the day, he found small ledges where he could rest against the rock. The gear was gradually falling into disrepair. The thin cord he used for insurance had frayed from the constant rubbing against ice and rocks. At some point, Lefay had to abandon it. It was getting harder and harder to pull the rope after each descent. Now he descended without any insurance, using only crampons and an ice axe. His broken arm was swollen and almost didn't move, and every touch to it caused a sharp pain. On the 4th day of descent, he passed the most difficult parts of the southern wall. Now the slope was less steep, but there was a new danger: numerous cracks in the glacier, many of which were hidden under a thin layer of snow. One wrong move, and you could fall into a bottomless ice abyss. By the evening of the 5th day, October 16th, a weary Lefay spotted the base camp tents of a Slovenian expedition working on a different route below. The bright orange and yellow tents against the white snow seemed like beacons of salvation. He was so exhausted that he couldn't even shout for attention. He just continued to descend slowly, heading towards the tents, each step with great difficulty. The Slovenian climbers were the first to spot the lone figure on the glacier. At first, they could not believe their eyes. A dark silhouette on the white slope was slowly moving in their direction. No one expected to see any of the French twosome alive after such a storm. News of their disappearance had already reached the base camp. Several Slovenes rushed towards them when they realized it was indeed a man. When Lefay finally reached their camp, he looked more like a ghost than a living person. His face was blackened by frost and wind. His clothes were tattered against the rocks, and his right arm hung lifelessly along his body. Fortunately, there was a doctor among the Slovenes who immediately examined the injured arm and gave him an anesthetic injection. 5 days without food, with a fractured arm, in a constant struggle for every meter of descent, completely exhausted the French climber's strength. But the worst of the ordeal was over. He descended from an altitude of 7,300 meters to the base camp at 4,200 meters, overcoming one of the most difficult routes in the Himalayas, in conditions that most experts considered incompatible with survival. This descent will go down in the history of mountaineering as one of the most incredible rescues. At the base camp of the Slovenian expedition, the fight for Lefay's life began. The expedition doctor examined the fracture and put a temporary splint made of improvised materials. The injury was serious. The forearm bone was broken, and urgent medical care under normal conditions was required. Morphine dulled the pain that plagued Lefay all the days of the descent. The climbers helped him take off his frozen clothes and wrapped him in warm sleeping bags. 5 days without proper food and water, in extreme cold and physical strain, had pushed his body to its limits. He could hardly swallow. His throat was swollen from dehydration. The Slovenians gave him warm tea with sugar in small sips, gradually bringing him back to life. Immediately, a message was radioed to Kathmandu that an urgent evacuation was needed. But the weather, as if testing Lefay one last time, intervened again. Heavy rains in the valleys made it impossible for the rescue helicopter to approach. Lefay spent 2 days at the Slovenian base camp, balancing between exhaustion and gradual recuperation. The morning of October 19th brought a long-awaited improvement in the weather. The sound of an approaching helicopter echoed through the valley. The pilots, risking their lives, managed to land the machine on a small area near the base camp. Lefay was loaded into the helicopter and headed for Kathmandu, where doctors were already waiting for him. At the hospital in Kathmandu, it was discovered that in addition to a broken arm and general exhaustion, Lefay had received slight frostbite on his fingers and toes. But given the conditions in which he had spent his last days, doctors called his condition remarkably good. Many climbers have been left disabled or lost fingers to frostbite after similar ordeals. While Lefay was recovering in a Kathmandu hospital, a search operation was organized to locate Pierre Béguin's body. As soon as the weather improved, several helicopters surveyed the lower part of the south face and the glacier at its foot, where the dead climber was believed to be. The search was complicated by the huge territory. In a fall from a height of more than 1,000 meters, Béguin's body could be in any of the many glacial crevasses. The freshly fallen snow brought by the storm made the task even more difficult, hiding all traces of the fall. A ground search for Béguin's body was deemed too dangerous. The risk of avalanches in the area remained high, and traveling across the crevassed glacier without knowing the exact location of the deceased would be an unreasonable risk for the rescuers. After several days of unsuccessful attempts, the search was officially called off. The body of Pierre Béguin, one of the foremost mountaineers of his generation, remains in the eternal ice of Annapurna, the mountain to which he devoted much of his life. The story of Béguin and Lefay's ascent of Annapurna in October 1992 changed the world of mountaineering forever. Lefay's descent has been called the greatest self-rescue in the history of the Himalayas by experts. Legendary mountaineer Reinhold Messner, the first to conquer all the world's 8,000ers, said it was a feat beyond human capability. After his recovery, Lafay did not abandon mountaineering. On the contrary, the tragedy seemed to give him new strength. In 1993, he returned to the Himalayas and climbed the 8,201-meter-high Cho Oyu Peak. In 1994, he soloed a new route on the north face of Shishapangma, but Annapurna did not let him go. He returned to it 3 times and finally reached its summit in 2002, 10 years after his tragic attempt with Began. This story has been continued in the movies as well. In 2012, French filmmaker Christophe Rila made the documentary Survivre à l'Annapurna, Surviving on Annapurna, which detailed the events of 1992. The film was a tribute to Pierre Beguin and a testament to the incredible fortitude of Jean-Christophe Lafay. In a startling twist of fate, Lafay died in 2006 during a solo winter ascent of Makalu, another 8,000-meter peak in the Himalayas. He went missing at around 7,600 meters, almost as his teacher Began had done 14 years earlier. The story closed in a tragic way. Both outstanding mountaineers were forever in the arms of the Himalayan giants to whom they dedicated their lives. It was as if the mountains themselves had decided to keep them with them. The south face of Annapurna remained unclimbed for a long time in the style that Began and Lafay had planned. It wasn't until 2013 that Swiss mountaineer Willy Steck managed to complete their route alone in 28 hours, an achievement that is considered one of the greatest in the history of mountaineering. Steck dedicated his ascent to the memory of Beguin and Lafay, whose 1992 attempt paved the way for future generations. What do you think of this story? Is Begin's decision to go down in the storm a mistake? Or would a long wait in a tent have been even more dangerous? What drove Lafay to return to Annapurna again and again? Was it guilt, a tribute to his teacher, or a desire to overcome his fear? Perhaps the bigger question is whether the risk is worth the goals climbers set for themselves. Began and Lafay sought the limit of human possibility, and both found it in the mountains they loved. But their story also showed something else: what a man is capable of when his life is on the line. If you liked this story, put a like. It will help similar stories find their audience. Subscribe to the channel. There are many more exciting stories about human resilience, courage, and overcoming themselves. See you in the next issue.